This video is all about why I think that Lee Harvey Oswald was a Soviet asset who was used by U.S. intelligence, but Oswald was not aware that he was being used by U.S. intelligence. That's what I think the situation was before the assassination, and this video I'm going to go over why I think that. Oswald's older brother, Robert Oswald, told the Warren Commission after the assassination they had during the winter of 1945, gone to Boston. Now he's talking about are Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother Marguerite. So Lee and his mother had during the winter of 1945 gone to Boston, where they stayed, I would say, for approximately 6 months. I understand Mr. Ekdahl had been married and had a son by a prior marriage, and they had lived together, all of them, Lee, my mother, Mr. Ekdahl, and his son, in Boston. Now, Mr. Ekdahl was Marguerite Oswald's second husband and Lee Harvey Oswald's stepfather for a short period of time. And in 1945, when Oswald was 6 years old and Robert Oswald was 10 years old, Robert Oswald was with his brother, his older brother John Pick. Both of them were in military school at this time, and Marguerite and Lee and Mr. Ekdahl all went to Boston and lived with his son there for 6 months, according to Robert Oswald. Now, we have lots of letters from Marguerite to Robert, even when Robert was a child, and he would have been 10 at this time. But we have no letters from Marguerite or from Edwin Ekdahl from Boston or from this period, that is the winter of 1945. So the only evidence we have about what Lee and Marguerite were doing at this time in 1945 comes from Robert and from John Pick. He also says something similar to this when he talks to the Warren Commission. And I mistakenly said there that Edwin Ekdahl was Marguerite's second husband. She was actually her third husband. And I also note here that Marguerite, of course, was alive after the assassination. The Warren Commission did not ask her anything about Boston. So this is the only information we have. It comes from Robert Oswald and from John Pick, that they went to Boston and lived with Edwin Ekdahl's son in Boston. Edwin Ekdahl's only son, according to all of the evidence we have, was Dewey Ekdahl, and Dewey Ekdahl was born in 1931 in China. So at the time that Lee Oswald and Marguerite would have been living with him for 6 months in Boston, Dewey Ekdahl would have been 14 years old. And according to the FBI, who said they talked to Dewey Ekdahl on December 6, 1963, Dewey Ekdahl never knew the name of his father's second wife or anything about her. So obviously, if Dewey Ekdahl had been 14 when they lived with him for 6 months, he would remember them. He would remember Lee and Marguerite, I'm sure, if he was 14 years old when they lived with him for 6 months. So in my view, this is not credible. That is, the evidence here is contradictory. And what I choose to believe here is that Dewey Ekdahl truthfully told the FBI that he didn't know anything about Lee or Marguerite Oswald, and that therefore the story we have that Lee and Marguerite Oswald lived with Dewey Ekdahl and Edwin Ekdahl, his father, for 6 months in 1945 or over the holidays of 1945, that is not true. That Lee and Marguerite did not live with Dewey Ekdahl. And as I said before, Boston is just about the only thing the Warren Commission did not ask Marguerite Oswald about. They completely skipped over Boston for some reason. And I'll note here that we have no indication whatsoever that Dewey Ekdahl ever lived in Boston. All we have on him is that he lived in New York. In fact, according to the 1940 census, and this is 5 years before Dewey supposedly was living with Marguerite and Lee for 6 months, in 1940, Dewey was living in New York already with his father and his mother, Rosmina Ekdahl. And also, Edwin Ekdahl lived in New York City, according to FBI documents. Edwin Ekdahl lived in New York City when he died in 1953 as an employee of Ebasco Services Incorporated. And Edwin Ekdahl was working for Ebasco in 1945 also. So we have every indication here that Dewey probably lived in New York City in 1945, not Boston, because that's where his father had been living. Now, someone is mentioned here as living in Boston. That's Elvira Elizabeth Larson. That's Edwin Ekdahl's sister. Mrs. Larson received the insurance money as a result of Edwin Ekdahl's death, a policy that he had taken out involving his employment. His sister, who lived in Boston, received the insurance money as a result of her brother's death and informed Ebasco she was sending some of it to Ekdahl's son, name unknown. And according to the FBI, Ebasco's employment record did not indicate the area of the United States in which Ekdahl worked from 1943 to 1953, and Miss Maruscello advised the Ebasco company would not be able to furnish this information. Now, this seems very odd to me that Ebasco is unable to tell the FBI where Edwin Ekdahl worked over a 10-year period up until his death. I think that's very strange, and I think that indicates there's something funny going on here. That is, that probably Ekdahl, or his information, is probably being hidden at the request of some government agency. That's what I think. So what do we know about Dewey's mother? Well, Rosima E. Ekdahl, according to the 1940 census, was living in New York with her husband Edwin Ekdahl and her son Dewey. And we know that Edwin and Rosima married in China, in Shanghai, according to the marriage certificate, in 1925. And according to Edwin Ekdahl's brother-in-law, as told to the FBI, Rosmina, Edwin Ekdahl's first wife, died in 1961. And Dewey told the FBI that his mother and father separated in approximately 1942. Now, Dewey said there that his parents had been separated. Nowhere is it explicitly stated anywhere that Edwin Ekdahl had ever divorced his first wife. And in fact, the FBI went looking for evidence of a divorce, and apparently they looked in Boston. I don't know why they would look in Boston, since all indications are that they all lived in New York. But apparently they looked in Boston and found no record of it there. Perhaps there's a record of the divorce in New York City, I don't know. But as Mrs. Murrett said, and that's Marguerite Oswald's sister, I imagine they were married in Texas. Mr. Ekdahl was a divorced man. I guess he was a divorced man. He had to be. I don't know, but I don't think he could get married without being divorced. So I think there's a serious question here as to whether Ekdahl had even divorced his first wife before he married Oswald's mother. Now, one possible explanation for Robert Oswald's story that Marguerite and Lee had been living in Boston with Ekdahl and his son in 1945, it could be that Ekdahl and his first wife had been separated or divorced or whatever, and that Dewey went to live with Ekdahl's sister and her husband. I don't know if they had children or not, but that's a possible explanation. It could be that this story is true, except that would still leave unexplained why it is that Dewey doesn't know anything about Marguerite and Lee. They were quite a couple of characters, Marguerite and Lee, and I'm sure that if he had lived with them for any period of time when he was 14 years old, that he would remember them. So I don't think we have a good explanation here for any of this. Now, about the marriage itself, Lillian Murrett, Marguerite's sister, told the Warren Commission this, and they say that Mr. Ekdahl was a sick man and had a bad heart, and he was a little older than she was, and she didn't seem very enthusiastic about marrying Mr. Ekdahl. And that's when his sister, Ekdahl's sister, came down here to Louisiana from Boston, and she liked Marguerite a lot, and she said, "Why don't you go ahead and marry him? He's lonesome," and so forth. And she just decided, I guess, to marry Ed. So what it looks like she's saying here is that Edwin Ekdahl's sister talked Marguerite into marrying Edwin Ekdahl, even though she didn't feel very enthusiastic about doing so. So what we have here is this is the same sister who lives in Boston, who got the $15,000 insurance policy after Ekdahl died, and she helped convince Marguerite to marry him. So what this looks like to me is a plot of sorts. It may be a rather innocent plot. I don't think so, but it looks like that Ekdahl and his sister conspired to get Marguerite Oswald to marry him. And I think that's worth noting. There's not a lot of information on Ekdahl's sister Elvira, but I found this online. In 1937, she wrote a thesis, "The Cooperative Movement in Denmark," by Elvira Ekdahl Larsen, submitted in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Master of Commercial Science. Or it was published in 1937. Apparently she wrote it in 1935. So apparently Ekdahl's sister was a big fan of the cooperative movement. And reading a little bit from her thesis here, "The movement in society which is adapting the old principles of service to the present economic system is what is called the cooperative movement. It is making for the evolution of society in which service is the dominant motive of industry. Our present-day interpretation of a cooperative society is a voluntary association in which the people organize democratically to supply their needs through mutual action, and in which the motive of production and distribution is service, not profit. In the cooperative movement, the ultimate tendency is toward the creation of a social structure capable of supplanting both profit-making industry and the compulsory state." So, according to Elvira, the cooperative movement, she's trying to draw a distinction here, I think, between capitalism and communism. Capitalism is the profit-making industry, and communism, at this time, would be seen as probably the compulsory state, because we have the Soviet example at this time. And what she favors, apparently, is neither one of these systems, and yet it's very concerned with the same things that communism is concerned with. That is, the exploitation of the workers by the capitalists. And this is the answer to that problem, in her view. The cooperative movement is the answer. So it's not communist, but it's anti-capitalist. And I think that's an important element in the story here. Ekdahl's sister is an anti-capitalist. And while she may not have been pro-Soviet at the time she wrote this paper in 1935, by 1945, 10 years later, she may have changed her mind. She may have come to the conclusion, and I'm just speculating, of course, that a person had to take a stand with one or the other here, the Coke or the Pepsi, like our modern politics, Republican or Democrat. Well, here the choices are the capitalist United States or the communist Soviet Union. So perhaps, since she obviously is concerned with the problems of capitalism and is anti-capitalist, if she believes in service of the people, not profit, as she states here, then it might be by 1945 or in that period that she had changed her mind and decided that Soviet communism was better than American capitalism. Of course, I'm just speculating, but it would be consistent, I think, with her economic philosophy demonstrated in her support of the cooperative movement. I also think it's interesting that she mentions her husband in the foreword of her thesis here. And I think it's important to understand something about her husband, because by the time of the assassination, Elvira had died. She died in February of 1963, according to this FBI report. So the FBI talked to her husband after the assassination, because they couldn't talk to Elvira Larson. So instead of talking to Ekdal's sister, they talked to Ekdal's brother-in-law. So that guy, Mr. Julius Larson, whom the FBI spoke with after the assassination, is the same person being talked about here. I am indebted in no small measure to my husband for some of the information I have acquired on this subject of Danish cooperatives. He too was born in Denmark and lived the early part of his life on a Danish farm. He attended the Folk High School and the Technical School, which schools have been described as very hotbeds of the cooperative movement. He has therefore a thorough understanding and knowledge of the principles of the Danish cooperative movement in relation to the nation's progress. So here we have Elvira Ekdal Larson and her husband, both of whom seem to be very, very interested and presumably supportive of the cooperative movement, which is an anti-capitalist movement. I've already shown this graphic in this video, but I want to show it again because it shows that Ekdal and his wife, his first wife, were married in China. I think it says 1925 there. Maybe it says 1928. I think I said 1925 before. Oh, no, they were married in 1925, it says. And Dewey Ekdal, the son, was born in China in 1931. And now I want to introduce John Dewey. John Dewey was an American philosopher, psychologist, and educational reformer. He was one of the most prominent American scholars in the first half of the 20th century. John Dewey. And you may have already figured out why I want to introduce him. I don't know. But I think Dewey Ekdal was named after John Dewey. And John Dewey, wrote a book in 1929, which was 2 years before Dewey Ekdal's birth, Impressions of Soviet Russia and the Revolutionary World, a glowing travelogue of the nascent USSR, or USSR, only two S's there. And no doubt, I think, I shouldn't say no doubt, but probably Ekdal would have read that book, I think. And apparently it was a glowing travelogue from the nascent USSR, which, of course, I have not read. And John Dewey, in 1919, went to China and was a very, very popular speaker in China for 2 years. In these 2 years, Dewey gave nearly 200 lectures to Chinese audiences and wrote nearly monthly articles for Americans in the New Republic and other magazines. And this, of course, was before Chairman Mao had taken over China. So this was pre-communist China, where Dewey was giving speeches. And Greg Parker, who is or was, whichever, I don't know now, I haven't heard about him for a while. Greg Parker, who was very good at research, though not very good at interpretation, in my opinion. He told me this. I have copies of his, and he means Ekdal's passport, showing he entered China in March 1919 to work for the Midway Packing Company in Shanghai. 1919 is the same year that John Dewey, went to Shanghai, and Shanghai, or I should say Dewey, was there for 2 years in China, presumably spending more time in Shanghai. And we know that Ekdal, when he got married, was in Shanghai, according to the marriage certificate. So I think it's very likely that Edwin Ekdal actually heard John Dewey speak in China, perhaps in Shanghai, in the period from 1919 to 1921, or 22, I guess it is. There's an awful lot of coincidence here. And I think this explains why Dewey Ekdal was named Dewey, because his father, at least, perhaps his mother too, I don't know much about his mother. I don't know anything about her political beliefs, but I think we have a John Dewey fan here in Edwin Ekdal, and that he named his son Dewey because he was a big fan of John Dewey. And this is more from the Wikipedia on John Dewey. While the 1894 Pullman strike, while Dewey was at the University of Chicago, his letters to his wife Alice and his colleague Jane Addams reveal that he closely followed the 1894 Pullman strike, in which the employees of the Pullman Palace car factory in Chicago decided to go on strike after industrialist, or capitalist, George Pullman refused to lower rents in his company town after cutting his workers' wages by nearly 30%. On May 11, 1894, the strike became official, later gaining the support of members of the American Railway Union, whose leader, Eugene V. Debs, called for a nationwide boycott of all trains, including Pullman sleeping cars. Considering most trains had Pullman cars, the main 24 lines out of Chicago were halted, and the mail was stopped as the workers destroyed trains all over the United States. President Grover Cleveland used the mail as a justification to send in the National Guard, and ARU leader Eugene Debs was arrested. Now, if you read on about this, Dewey obviously sides with the workers. What he says about the upper classes is very disapproving, and he defends Eugene Debs. So he was not a communist, but he obviously took the side of the workers when considering events like this. And reading, I'm not a student of his work, of course, but I've read some of it in the Wikipedia article, and he seems to be the sort of person who would support the cooperative movement, though I don't know if he did or not. But I think it's interesting that we have Edwin Ekdal, I think, naming his son after John Dewey, Edwin Ekdal's sister being a big supporter of the cooperative movement, which is, in some sense, an anti-capitalist movement, and her husband, also, Ekdal's brother-in-law, also apparently was a big supporter of the cooperative movement, which is anti-capitalism, and which shares many of the same concerns that communists have, even if these people didn't identify themselves as communists. So I don't think it would be surprising to find out that Edwin Ekdal, his sister, and his brother-in-law all had sympathy for socialist and communist Soviet Union versus the capitalist United States. I don't think that would be a very surprising reality. And now let's take a look at the paperwork from the divorce between Marguerite Oswald, or Marguerite Ekdahl, and Edwin Ekdahl. And cutting to the final page here, wherefore, premises considered, plaintiff prays that defendant be cited to appear and answer herein, defendant being Marguerite Oswald, that is Edwin Ekdahl, sued for divorce from his wife Marguerite, and answer herein on that final hearing hereof, plaintiff have judgment dissolving the marriage now existing between plaintiff and defendant, that the defendant, that is Marguerite, be ordered to return plaintiff's 1944 diary and other private papers. And this is signed by Fred Korth, who was an attorney representing Edwin Ekdahl. And coincidentally, Fred Korth went on to become a high official in the federal government, in the Navy, and eventually becoming the Secretary of the Navy. And here's an article in the newspaper, in the New York Times Herald apparently, which was published when Fred Korth resigned his position as Secretary of the Navy shortly before the assassination. This was October 14th, 1963, that this newspaper article appeared. So Fred Korth, attorney for Edwin Ekdahl in his divorce from Marguerite Oswald, eventually went on to become Secretary of the Navy. And I view that to be a significant coincidence. And I speculate that this 1944 diary and other private papers of Edwin Ekdahl, which Marguerite Oswald had pilfered and was ordered to return, was or included incriminating evidence about Edwin Ekdahl, that he was a Soviet asset contacting perhaps other assets or potential assets for the Soviet Union. That is, we know that Ekdahl was traveling around the country with Marguerite during this period, and the diary would document his travels and meetings with people, and this, I think, probably provided evidence that he was working on behalf of the Soviet Union, and that Fred Korth was given this material by Marguerite as a result of the court order, and that therefore Fred Korth knew all about this, and that he probably provided it to American intelligence, and this helped to grease his way to the top of the Navy, the cabinet position of Secretary of the Navy. That is, by exposing to American intelligence Edwin Ekdahl as a Soviet asset, he was able to leverage his way to become Secretary of the Navy and to execute other dishonest deeds for which he resigned that post, apparently. So I think the circumstances here provide an explanation which includes Edwin Ekdahl being a Soviet asset and Fred Korth coincidentally becoming Secretary of the Navy, and U.S. intelligence finding out that Edwin Ekdahl was a Soviet asset. So here, the situation as I propose it is that Edwin Ekdahl is a Soviet asset, that American intelligence knows that he's a Soviet asset, But Ekdahl doesn't know that they know. So I think that by marrying Marguerite Oswald, Edwin Ekdahl acquired a new Soviet asset, that is Lee Harvey Oswald, and I think probably the purpose of this was to provide some other boy with an identity that could not be connected to Soviet assets. That is, I think there's another boy whom I cannot name that Edwin Ekdahl already had as an asset, or was already a Soviet asset, who was being groomed to be a Soviet asset, and that they needed the identity of another boy to provide this other boy with cover. That is, to have an asset or to have an identity which could not be connected to a Soviet asset. Maybe that's a little complex, and I think there's evidence that there were two people using the name Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know if I'll get into that in this video or not, but I think that probably Edwin Ekdahl's job here as a Soviet asset was to find another boy whose identity could be used in order to hide the true identity of the Soviet asset they already had, and that the other boy, not Lee Harvey Oswald, was the real spy, and that Oswald was kind of a dummy, and that his identity would be used for the real spy. That's what I think the evidence implies, and that's my explanation of the evidence. But I haven't proven it, of course. And with that in mind, let's go to an excerpt from the FBI interview with Julius Larson, that is the husband of Edwin Ekdahl's sister, the late Elvira Ekdahl Larson. And so this is that brother-in-law whom I say the evidence indicates had a very strong interest in the cooperative movement, thus making him sympathetic, according to my view, to the Soviet Union. Dewey was never told... well, let's read from the top here. Since Edwin Ekdahl's death, Mr. and Mrs. Larson have assisted Dewey Ekdahl financially with money for his education and a home, and have spent all of the $15,000 on him. This was that $15,000 life insurance policy that Ekdahl's sister collected. Dewey was never told that this money came from his father, and Mr. Larson specifically requested that he not be told now. Now, I've considered this issue for quite a lot, and I can't come up with any reasonable explanation for why Dewey would not be told that this money came from his father. Dewey did inherit money from his father, and therefore you would think he wouldn't even have needed this money. He inherited stocks and bonds, I believe it was. I don't know the amount, the value of that, but he inherited probably a considerable amount of money anyway from his father, and I don't see why Ekdahl's sister wouldn't want him to know this money had come from his father. If she's nice enough to give him the money, why would she want to trick him into thinking she was giving him her own money? It doesn't make sense to me in any other way except that this money was not actually given to Dewey, that this money was used for some other purpose. And I think probably this money was used for the purpose of supporting that other boy, whose name I do not know. That is, the other boy who was being groomed as a Soviet spy, who needed Lee Harvey Oswald's identity as cover. I think that's what explains this. That is, that the brother-in-law didn't want Dewey to be told that the money came from his father, because if he had been told that, he would say, what money? Because he never got that money. That's what I think this means. And why would the FBI cooperate with such a request unless they were helping to cover up the truth? If the FBI is really investigating this, they would go to Dewey and tell him that the money came from his father, and try to get the truth from Dewey about things. The FBI would not honor such a request if they were really investigating and trying to find out what happened. And when this information was first made public by the FBI, this request that Dewey not be told where the money actually came from was redacted from the public version of the information. You can see here that request has been blacked out on the document. And I don't have the dates of when these two documents were released, that is, the document that shows the information and the document in which it was redacted. But Dewey died in the 1990s, and it looks to me, although I don't have the dates as I said, that while he was alive this information did not become public. And so it looks like the FBI cooperated in hiding this information from the public and from Dewey. And by hiding the request that Dewey not be told where this money came from, it removes that question, the implied question as to why he not be told. And therefore, it's unlikely that while Dewey is alive that anyone's going to ask him about this, because no one's going to be suspicious about him not being told where the money came from. So there's no way that Dewey Ekdahl could have contradicted the assertion that he was given this $15,000. And I think that means that he was not given this $15,000, and the FBI knew that he was not given this $15,000, and the FBI cooperated in covering up the fact that this $15,000 was given to somebody, but not to Dewey. And as I've already said, I think that $15,000 was used to support the other boy, the real spy being groomed for the Soviet Union, and that Oswald was just being used for his identity to give this other boy cover. Now, as I seem to be making a comprehensive video here, I think I should provide some of the evidence as to why I think there were two people using the name Lee Harvey Oswald. That is, that he was involved with another person about his own age, and they were both using one identity. This is from an FBI document. I did a cut and paste here so it'll fit nicely on the screen. From after the assassination, reporting an article in a French language weekly newspaper Minute of August 21, 1964, in which Marina Oswald said, "I had two husbands. Lee, the father of my children, an affectionate and kind man, and Harvey Oswald, the assassin of President Kennedy." So even though, of course, she means this to be taken symbolically or, not literally, she does say, I think with deceiver's delight, that she had two husbands, Lee and Harvey, or Harvey and Lee, as you may have heard it stated by persons other than myself. This photograph is a Warren Commission exhibit which belonged to Lee and Marina Oswald, a photograph that was taken in the Soviet Union, and it shows a man standing there by the river, and Marina Oswald told the FBI that that man was Lee Harvey Oswald, and it seems obvious to me that he doesn't look anything like Oswald in the version of the photo on the top. In the version on the photo on the bottom, it looks more like Oswald, but as you can see, that's an extremely dark version of the photo. Now that bottom version, the darkened one, was scanned from the Warren Commission report, and the version on top was scanned by John Armstrong at the National Archives. So what I think is that somebody on the Warren Commission, who knows who it could be, realized that this was not really Lee Harvey Oswald, and that therefore it had to be altered to make it look more like Oswald, and I think it was altered by darkening it to hide the alterations to the face and head, which I think were made. And you can see on the right there, I've got an enlarged portion of the photos from each one showing the head of the person who's allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think in the brighter, more normal looking photograph, it clearly is not Oswald. And in the altered version, it does kind of look like Oswald. And I think this demonstrates that the Warren Commission, or somebody on the Warren Commission, knew this wasn't Oswald and was hiding that fact, and also that Marina Oswald knew that she had two husbands, as she said earlier, or as I showed earlier, and that she knew this was the other guy, this wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, but that she had been told to pretend in her statements that she had only one husband and that it was Lee Harvey Oswald. So I think this means that the guy she married was the other guy, the guy we could call Harvey, and that's Harvey in this photograph, or the original version, which I think is the one on the top. And this means there are two of them. There's Lee Harvey Oswald, and there's Harvey Oswald, and Lee Oswald is providing the identity to be used by Harvey. And I think this is another instance of Marina saying that she had two husbands. This comes from the Warren Commission testimony of John Pick, and he's describing a conversation that he and his wife had with Marina while Lee Harvey Oswald was absent. And this would have been before the assassination, of course. And Pick says Marina was trying to make a point about her wedding ring. Being she couldn't speak English, Vada got the impression that Marina had been married before. Well, I think Marina was probably trying to tell her that she had two husbands, or that she wasn't really married to Lee, or maybe that Harvey gave her the ring, something like that. But she couldn't speak English. She could only speak Russian. And Mr. Jenner, who's questioning him, says that Marina had been married before. Yes, sir. This is the only thing she could gather from Marina flashing her wedding ring and talking about this. The four of us were present, Robert, myself, and the two wives, but this was done over coffee. This was after Lee and Marina had left? Yes, sir, this was after they had left. What did Robert say on that subject, if anything? Nothing. That he didn't think she had been married before. So I think it's significant that Lee is absent here, because he would have put a stop to this talk of Marina saying she had two husbands. And I think it's interesting that Robert is cooperating, at least after the assassination. He's cooperating with the authorities, and perhaps before the assassination. So it might be interesting that Robert Oswald suggested to John Pick that this is nothing. She hadn't been married before. Of course, what I think she was saying is not that she had been married before, but that she had two husbands. And so this isn't explicit. Its meaning is not obvious, but I think in the context of what I've been saying here, it's pretty clear, or it becomes obvious in the context, that Marina is once again saying that she has two husbands. And this is the Bronx Zoo photo, allegedly, of Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in New York City in 1953, which coincidentally just happens to be the time that Edwin Ekdahl died in New York City. We have no evidence that Marguerite and Lee, who moved to New York City in 1953, we have no evidence that they ever met Edwin Ekdahl there. This was a few years after the divorce, 5 years after the divorce. But I think it's interesting that shortly after Marguerite and Lee moved to New York City, that Edwin Ekdahl died. Though I don't have any explanation for that coincidence, but I think it's interesting. But anyway, this is allegedly Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't think it looks like Oswald, and I'm not the only one. His brother, John Pick, didn't think so either. This is from John Pick's Warren Commission testimony, where Jenner asks. Then right below that is a picture of a young man standing in front of an iron fence, which appears to be probably at a zoo. Do you recognize that? Sir, from that picture, I could not recognize that is Lee Harvey Oswald. That young fellow is shown there. He doesn't look like you recall Lee looked in 1952 and 1953 when you saw him in New York City? No, sir. So even though John Pick saw Lee Harvey Oswald at about the same time in New York City, he doesn't recognize that as being his brother, Lee Harvey Oswald. So apparently, John Pick, who never commented publicly about the assassination or about anything, the only thing we have from John Pick is his Warren Commission testimony. Apparently, John Pick and I both think this does not look like Lee Harvey Oswald. And Pick had seen him at about the same time in New York City. So he should be able to recognize his brother, especially since he had seen him recently being recent to this photograph, not recent to when he's testifying. And I think Pick does not recognize him because it's not Lee Harvey Oswald. This is the other boy. This is Harvey. This is the other boy that Ekdahl provided that $15,000 for in his life insurance policy. And it was given to his support, as I speculate, by Ekdahl's sister, Elvira Ekdahl Larson. This is not Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, the official story wants us to believe that the zoo photo was taken by Robert Oswald, Lee's brother, and this is put forth in Robert Oswald's Warren Commission testimony, which this comes from. Jenner says, in spending time with him, did you take him around or accompany him visiting various places in New York City? He took me around, sir. Did you have occasion during that period to take any photographs, snapshots of Lee? Here Jenner is setting up the question for the zoo photo. But then Robert Oswald says, I certainly can identify the one appearing in life. Yes, sir, I did. Now this reveals that Robert Oswald already knows what Jenner is talking about. He's talking about the Bronx Zoo photo, which by the time of this testimony, had appeared in Life magazine. But Jenner says, just hold your answers right in this area exactly to my questions. I'm sorry. So what this reveals to me is that Robert Oswald is jumping the gun here. He's speaking off script or out of sequence as to what Jenner wants. Jenner wants it to appear in the testimony transcript that Jenner is asking about the zoo photo, but Robert Oswald shows that he already knows that Jenner is asking about the zoo photo. So I think this reveals that this is a rehearsed dialogue going on here, that Robert Oswald has already been rehearsed, has already been coached on this topic, and that he hasn't been coached well enough, and that he's jumping the gun here, revealing that he knows what he's about to be questioned about, even though he shouldn't already know what he's about to be questioned about. And then Jenner continues, were these taken with your camera, or was it a camera that your mother or brother owned or had? This was my camera. And then Allen Dulles, former director of the CIA, asks, what do these questions refer to? Do they refer to the pictures in Life? And Jenner says, well, I really did not want to refer to that at the moment. So here Allen Dulles perks up when he realizes, or when he recognizes, that discussion of the Bronx Zoo photo is being initiated. And I think that's worth noting because Allen Dulles, the former director of the CIA, fired by John Kennedy, is taking notice here, and this happens occasionally when something important is coming up. And I also think it's important here that Mr. Jenner uses the plural. He says, "Were these taken with your camera?" These is the plural, implying that there's more than one photograph taken with Robert's camera in New York City. Yet this is the only photograph discussed with Robert about any photo he took in New York City. And it's the only one we have that could have been taken by Robert in New York City, allegedly taken by Robert in New York City. So what Jenner seems to be trying to do here is to make it look like, oh, there's a bunch of photos, and this is just one of them, when really it's all about the zoo photo. This is important. It's important to Jenner, it's important to Robert Oswald, and it's important to Allen Dulles. And therefore, if we want to know what really happened here in the assassination and the Oswald story, it should be important to us. And then Robert Oswald continues, "The Bronx Zoo, I believe, was about the only time I can recall taking any pictures of him." So as far as Robert Oswald knows, this important photo is the only photo he took of Lee in New York City. And then Jenner says, "I am at liberty to advise you, Mr. Oswald, that when your mother testified before the commission, she did produce a number of photographs, snapshots and otherwise, among which was a snapshot of your brother, Lee, taken at the New York Zoo, that she testified was taken at the New York Zoo. Is that the incident in which you took the photograph of your brother Lee, as far as you know?" Now, I think this is important, and I will get to Marguerite Oswald's testimony about this. But here, Jenner is connecting it to Marguerite's testimony so that we will think that this Bronx Zoo photo taken by Robert Oswald is the same photo that they were talking about when they were interviewing Marguerite Oswald. But the photo they were using when they were interviewing Marguerite Oswald is not in the Warren Commission evidence. That was an exhibit that was supposedly given back to Marguerite and did not appear in the evidence. I think it's not the same photo, but I'll get to that more when I talk about Marguerite Oswald's testimony. And Robert Oswald says, "You say the New York Zoo, sir. As far as I know, there is just one zoo up there, referred to as the Bronx Zoo. I do recall, and I still have the picture that I took of Lee at the Bronx Zoo. I certainly feel that perhaps either I sent copies of it to Mother or to Lee after I had the film developed." So I think it's interesting here that he does not say definitively that he did so. But we're supposed to think here. Clearly, we're supposed to think that Robert took this photo of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo and sent a copy of it to his mother, Marguerite Oswald. That's what we're supposed to think. That's what we're being told here. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we go over the testimony of Marguerite Oswald and what happened subsequently regarding this photograph. Now, getting on to Marguerite Oswald's testimony about a zoo photo, Lee Rankin says, "If you will permit me, I will ask the court reporter to identify these pictures, and I don't intend to offer them, but then I will ask you each one by one, or one by number, then I will ask you each one by number so we can make it clear, and then return them to you, so you can tell us what they are about. Is that all right with you?" "Yes, that is just fine, thank you." So what Rankin is saying here, he's going to show Marguerite Oswald some pictures that she brought for them to see, but he's not going to enter them into evidence. So even though we can infer what it is Marguerite Oswald is looking at and talking about, we cannot know for sure because these photographs were never entered into evidence. They were not given, or they were given exhibit numbers, but they never became exhibits. And this is already sounding very strange. We have some exhibits here which are given exhibit numbers, but which are not entered into evidence. I think that's very weird. And then Rankin says this: "Now, Mrs. Oswald, I will hand you exhibits 259 through 269, both inclusive, and ask you to take them, starting with exhibit 259, and referring to the exhibit in each case, tell the commission what the picture is about." All right, note here he says exhibits 259 through 269. And here, on a list of the Warren Commission exhibits provided by Mary Farrell Foundation website, we can see that we have Commission Exhibit 258, and then immediately after 258 is 270. And that's boxed in red there. So this shows that exhibits 259 through 269, the photographs that Rankin is showing to Marguerite Oswald, do not exist as commission exhibits in the Warren Commission report. They were given exhibit numbers for the purposes of Mrs. Oswald's testimony, but they did not become exhibits in the final report, so we cannot see what she actually is talking about. That is very weird. And then when Marguerite Oswald gets to exhibit 261, which does not exist in the evidence for us to look at, but we have to infer what it is from what she says. And she says, this is a picture of Lee at the Bronx Zoo, exhibit 261, at age 13. Rankin, that is the Bronx Zoo in New York? Yes, sir. That is the Bronx Zoo in New York that you told us about? Yes, sir. And she had talked about about Lee going to the Bronx Zoo earlier in her testimony. So Marguerite Oswald identifies a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, but we can't see the actual photograph she's looking at. We are supposed to infer that it's the same photograph allegedly taken by Robert Oswald, but we must infer that because the exhibit that Marguerite Oswald looks at does not exist for us to observe. But the Bronx Zoo photo does exist as Warren Commission exhibits. It exists in Warren Commission Exhibit 282, which is what they showed Robert Oswald. Now, Robert Oswald's testimony did come after Marguerite Oswald's testimony. So at the time that Marguerite Oswald is being questioned, this photo is not yet in evidence. So what they're doing is they're using a photo not in evidence and not putting it into evidence at this time. But they could have used the same photo, and this is from Life magazine, Commission Exhibit 282, and it doesn't say in Life magazine where this photo comes from. They could have used that same exhibit. That is, they could have shown the same exhibit to Marguerite Oswald that they showed to Robert Oswald, but they didn't do that. If they had done that, then we would know, or at least we would know the Warren Commission is saying that it's the same photograph. But the way the evidence exists, they're not saying it's the same photograph. It could be a different photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, and it might not be this photograph that Robert was talking about. This photograph also exists as Commission Exhibit 2893, and I believe this is a scan from the archives done by John Armstrong. But this shows that Commission Exhibit 2893, which has an FBI number of D33-9, it shows that this is one of the photos that was taken from Oswald's possessions, either his possessions or the possessions of he and his wife. It's one of the seized photos from the Oswald possessions that was seized by the FBI, or originally by the Dallas police. So this photo does not come from Marguerite Oswald or from Robert Oswald, and the one that Robert Oswald was shown didn't come from, it came from Life magazine, and Life magazine doesn't say where they got it. So as far as we know, only one of these photos exists, and that photo came from Lee Harvey Oswald's possessions. So the point I'm getting at, and have stated already and will state again, is that Marguerite Oswald could be looking at a completely different photo. A photo that actually is of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo. And that this photo here could be somebody else. And as I've said, I think this is Harvey, the boy being groomed to be a Soviet spy who was supported, according to my theory, by Edwin Ekdal's life insurance policy. Also, I think it's notable that the Warren Commission report version of this photo is significantly darkened compared to the archives version. The one in the middle top there is the version at the archives scanned by John Armstrong, and the one on the lower left there is a scan from the Warren Commission report. And there's no way you could be certain who that is in the Warren Commission version, and you get a better view of it from the National Archives version. This could be simply a matter of printing issues and scanning issues. It might not be that it was intentionally darkened. But I think it's interesting that it is darkened, and there's no way you could identify that person in the darkened version, whereas you might have a chance in the light version. So this is some sleight of hand going on here, coming from a lawyer, Lee Rankin, who should know better, who should understand the implications of evidence and exhibit numbers. But what's going on here is that they're making it so we cannot possibly know for sure what Marguerite Oswald is looking at, because the exhibit does not exist in the evidence, but that we can infer that it's the same photograph that Robert Oswald testified about. And I think that means it's not the same photograph. That what Marguerite Oswald had actually was a photograph of Lee Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, but that we have never seen it. And I should mention here that the date of the publication of the photograph in Life magazine and the date of Robert Oswald's testimony come after the testimony of Mrs. Oswald. So if you want to be an apologist for the Warren Commission, you can argue that the reason they didn't do it right is because they hadn't yet shown the photograph to Robert Oswald, and they didn't yet have that photograph in evidence. But still, I think all that requires is a little planning from the miscreants, and that even if this wasn't a planned thing, as I'm sure it was, if Lee Rankin wanted to introduce evidence and have Marguerite Oswald talk about it, then it's his responsibility, I think, to ensure that that evidence has an exhibit number. He doesn't have to possess the original photograph. They could make a copy. They copied many documents and photographs, and so I don't think there's any excuse here. I think the only reasonable explanation here, it's not that they're Keystone Cops and the Warren Commission, it's that they intentionally made it look as though we're talking about the same photograph here when we're not talking about the same photograph. And the reason is because if we saw both of them, that is, if we saw Marguerite Oswald's photograph and we saw the other photograph, then we would realize that it's two different boys at the Bronx Zoo. If my interpretation of the evidence is correct, and of course it is, that would mean that the miscreants would have a problem. That is, Marguerite Oswald would be leaving the Warren Commission and going home with a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, which is not the photograph that they're going to have in evidence. And if that ever became public, it would be obvious, probably, that these two pictures were of different boys and that one of them is not Oswald, and then it would have to be explained who the other boy was. And of course they couldn't let that happen, so they would have to do something to separate Marguerite Oswald from her photograph of Lee at the Bronx Zoo. And that's what they did. This is a memo from the Warren Commission. 2/13/64. Mr. John Doyle called and said he had a call from Mrs. Oswald, and John Doyle is an attorney representing Mrs. Oswald, advising she is missing a couple of her papers. At one point in her testimony yesterday, referred to the fact that they were in the back making copies. She had some letters that were in a file marked accident and defection. Mr. Jenner or Mr. Liebler may have a file on the same subject. The letters missing are some she wrote to her son while he was in Russia, which were returned to her. They had not been opened, but had been returned to her. She had never opened them since their return. The dates are probably somewhere around January 25th, 1960, and probably returned on May 12th, 1960. Or around March 12th, 1960. Mr. Doyle suggested that they may be sitting around and that we undoubtedly have photostatic copies of them. Call him and let him know. So, Mrs. Oswald's attorney is calling and asking the Warren Commission to return some documents, not photographs, but documents, that he and Mrs. Oswald thinks they have. And here's another Warren Commission memo that moves our story along, and it includes some repetition here. At 9:55 a.m., February 13th, 1964, Mr. John Doyle, counsel for Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, called, spoke to Mrs. Ida, and said he had received a call from Mrs. Oswald advising that she was missing a couple of her papers. Mr. Doyle said that Mrs. Oswald told him that the papers in question were in her file entitled Accident and Defection. The letters alleged to have been missing were letters that she wrote to her son when he was in Russia, which were returned to her. Mr. Doyle indicated that Mrs. Oswald told him that the letters had not been opened after they were returned to her, and that they may never have been opened since that time. A copy of the telephone message taken by Mrs. Ide is attached, and that is probably what I just read before. I was not aware of any of this until I arrived at the office at approximately 2 p.m. Mr. Doyle was here at that time and told me that upon further search, Mrs. Oswald had found the letters, which she at first thought were missing. Mr. Doyle told me, however, that Mrs. Oswald now claimed that one other letter was missing. The description of the letter was somewhat imprecise. I discussed the matter with Mr. Rankin on the telephone and with Mr. Schaffer in person, and decided that Mr. Doyle and I should go to Mrs. Oswald's hotel room, taking with us copies of each of the documents which Mrs. Oswald had made available for us for copying. We did this about 6 p.m. Mr. Spector accompanied us. Mr. Spector, of course, was Arlen Spector, the creator of the magic bullet theory. So Wesley Liebler, the author of this memo, and this guy, Arlen Spector, are going to head on over to Marguerite Oswald's hotel room to straighten out all this document stuff. Upon our arrival at her room, Mrs. Oswald stated that she had found the two unopened letters which were described in the attached memo of Mrs. Ide's conversation with Mr. Doyle. She also stated that the letter which she thought was now missing was one that she had written to Lee while he was in Russia concerning the filing of Lee's income tax return. According to Mrs. Oswald, that letter had also been returned to her, since Lee's address in Russia was unknown at that time. She said she had opened the letter at the time it was returned. Mr. Doyle and I immediately found the original of the letter in question in one of Mrs. Oswald's files. So Mr. Liebler is going through Mrs. Oswald's files. It was agreed by everyone present that such letter was not in fact missing from her files. It was then agreed by Mrs. Oswald, Mr. Doyle, and myself that the only file which had been copied outside of Mrs. Oswald's presence was her file captioned Accident and Defection. That file is also reflected in the attached memo of Mrs. Ide's conversation with Mr. Doyle. In order to assure Mrs. Oswald that all of the original documents which she had in that file at the time she came into the Commission's offices had been returned to her, we went through the file of copies which I had brought with me and made sure that Mrs. Oswald had in her possession each and every document from which those copies had been made. It developed that she did have all of those documents in her possession. She was completely satisfied at the time Mrs. Doyle, Spector, and I left her room, and that she had returned to her, prior to the time she left the Commission's offices Wednesday afternoon, all of the documents which she had at any time brought with her to such offices. Mrs. Oswald did not at any time or in any way indicate that she thought that any document had been purposefully removed from her files. Her only concern was that the 3 documents mentioned above might have been lost or otherwise misplaced during the process by which they were copied. Mrs. Oswald was completely satisfied upon the termination of the above conference that none of her documents had been lost, misplaced, or otherwise removed from her files at any time while she was in the offices of the Commission. Signed, W.J. Liebler. The above memorandum accurately reflects the events which occurred at the conference held in Mrs. Marguerite Oswald's room in the Hotel Willard, which began at approximately 6 p.m. February 13, 1964. Signed, Arlen Spector. So, of course, while Liebler and Spector were going through Marguerite Oswald's files, maybe they put a few things back, but they probably while Liebler was distracting Marguerite Oswald and Mr. Doyle, probably then Arlen Spector snagged the photograph of Lee Oswald at the Bronx Zoo so that Mrs. Oswald would no longer have that and no longer pose a threat to the scam. The scam being that this photograph is of Lee Harvey Oswald when actually it is of somebody else, presumably Harvey. Now, one might wonder why they would bother going through all of this when they could have just deep-sixed the photo of Harvey and let Marguerite show her photo of Lee, and then everything would look a lot better. Because this photo of the boy at the Bronx Zoo that we have does not look like Lee Harvey Oswald. So everything would have worked out better that way. But the trouble with that is that this photo of the boy at the zoo was released very early. It was released on December 15th, 1963, and it was published by the Associated Press. And presumably, though it is not said here, presumably that photo came from either the Dallas police, who had possession of that photo, which was seized from Oswald's possessions, or from the FBI. And these two photos were released together, and they both supposedly show the same boy, and separated by how many years, I don't know. But anyway, I don't think it looks like the same boy. And with this Bronx Zoo photo already having been published, the Warren Commission, the cover-up artists, would have to disappear the photo of Lee Oswald that had not been published. So that's the only thing they could do. They couldn't disappear this photo at the Bronx Zoo that we now have because it had already been published on December 15th, 1963. So instead, they decided to go through the charade of showing the photo to Marguerite Oswald, but not entering it into evidence, having her describe it as a photo of Lee Harvey Oswald at the Bronx Zoo, so that we would have an explanation for that photo that had already been published. And then Liebler and Spector went to her hotel room and grabbed that photo that she had that really was of Lee at the Bronx Zoo. And then they had Robert Oswald come on up and say that he took that photograph and sent a copy to his mother. He thinks possibly he sent a copy to his mother. And that would explain how Marguerite got a copy of that photo from Robert. So they created this story that cannot be proven false because they stole the photo that Marguerite had. Now you might think that Marguerite might have noticed this in Life magazine or this AP photo that was published in December, and maybe she did, but so what? She wasn't asked about it. How would we know that she had seen it? There probably were lots of mistaken things that occurred that she never commented on. They might have a risk that she might say something about something, but she wouldn't be able to prove anything because she doesn't have the photo anymore. The photo of her, the actual photo of her son. She doesn't have that anymore. The only photo that exists is this one. And this one, they have Robert saying he took it at the Bronx Zoo, even if it's not really of Lee Harvey Oswald, as John Pick couldn't recognize it, and I don't think it looks like him either. And so I think this all feeds into the same idea that I've been promoting here, that there was another boy, and I'll call him Harvey, and that was John Armstrong's idea, not mine. And I think that's why they had to weave this tangled web, is because they had to explain this photo as being Lee Harvey Oswald. And there are many other references in the evidence to a Harvey Oswald. This one comes from Ruth Paine in her testimony to the Warren Commission. She's contrasting the behavior, I think, of Lee with Harvey here. My recollection is that he was present most of the weekend. He went out to buy groceries, came in with a cheery call to his two girls saying, "Yabuchki," which means girls, the Russian word for girls, as he came in the door. It was more like Harvey than I had seen him before. He remembered this time I saw him reading a pocketbook. Now this to me, of course Ruth Paine never explicitly said anything about Harvey and Lee, but this sounds to me like a slip-up where Ruth Paine is revealing that she knows there's a Harvey and Lee, and that she's saying that Lee was acting a lot like Harvey. And I think the implication here is that Lee is a rotten husband to Marina, probably not her real husband anyway, even though she is technically married to both, probably. But I think she's contrasting rotten Lee's behavior with Harvey's behavior, and that Harvey was actually the loving husband, where Lee was just the asshole we all know from what everybody in the world said about him. And we have this here. This is John Pick's address book. And when he visited with brother Robert, or half-brother Robert and half-brother Lee Harvey on Thanksgiving Day 1962, half-brother Lee Harvey Oswald wrote his name in John Pick's address book as O-Harvey, presumably signifying Harvey Oswald. Now, I can't explain everything about this, but it's another instance where Lee is identified as Harvey. And if you think that Lee Harvey Oswald liked to be called Harvey Oswald, the only explicit evidence we have on that point comes from a fellow Marine here who apparently told the FBI that Oswald bitterly resented anyone calling him by his middle name of Harvey. or its shortened term Harv, and wanted to fight anyone who persisted in calling him these names. So, the only direct evidence we have on whether Harvey or whether Lee Harvey Oswald liked to be called Harvey comes from a fellow Marine who says that he would fight people who called him Harvey. So obviously, this Marine Pitts is saying that Oswald did not like being called Harvey. And maybe we should note that at this time, in 1962, John Pick had not seen Lee Harvey Oswald since he was 13 years old. So it might be that he wouldn't even be sure that was his brother. Though, like I said, I can't explain everything about this that needs to be explained.
Harvey Lee Oswald, Harvey Lee Oswald, Harvey Lee Oswald.
And speaking of the CIA, there's this well-known document which refers to the Oswald story as the Harvey story in an official CIA document.
Harvey Lee Oswald.
Numerous such Harvey examples can be cited. In fact, I think I've already made a video about this, if you want to go looking for it. So there's a lot of Harvey references here, and I think probably the secret boy, that is the boy who got the $15,000 paid for his support by Edwin Ekdahl's insurance policy, probably that boy's name is Harvey. Alright, this video has got a bit out of hand. It's gone over 15 minutes, as sure any of you have noticed if you're still around. So I think I'll bring it to a close here. I think there's ample evidence to support these conclusions. I haven't dealt with all of that in this video, but I'm going to tell you what I think, because it is my video, after all. Edwin Ekdahl recruited Lee Harvey Oswald to be a Soviet asset. I did deal with most of the evidence I'm aware of to support that. I don't think it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but I think that's the most reasonable conclusion to draw from the evidence. The Soviet purpose for Oswald was to use his identity for a trained Soviet spy. I think that's the extent of the Soviet intent here. I don't think they had any plans to kill the president. Oswald was a willing Soviet asset and considered himself to be a spy. The Soviets never intended to use Oswald as a presidential assassin, as I just said. U.S. intelligence knew that Ekdahl and Oswald were Soviet assets and used Oswald for their own purposes. Now, in this video, I dealt with the first part of that sentence, that they knew that Ekdahl and Oswald were Soviet assets, and that is what I conclude based upon the career trajectory of Fred Korth. But I didn't deal with how the American intelligence used Oswald here. I was going to do that, but we're already over an hour and 20 minutes, so I think I'll deal with that elsewhere. U.S. intelligence used Oswald as a scapegoat for their assassination of John Kennedy. I think that's what eventually happened. I think the Cubans were involved too, that there was a Cuban plot. U.S. intelligence knew all about it, and they used that plot to obtain their patsy, Oswald. I don't think Oswald ever thought that he was working for U.S. intelligence. That's the main difference I have with what most other people say about Oswald. I think he was a Soviet asset originally. His purpose was to provide an identity for another person, and that he got involved with a Cuban plot to assassinate Kennedy. I think that was really there, and that the CIA knew about that, and therefore they used Oswald, someone who was trying to kill the president anyway, as a scapegoat, as a patsy, and they could even feel good about it because Oswald was trying to kill Kennedy. So in their minds, he would be fair game. That it's okay to kill him because he really did participate in a plot to murder the president. So And I think there's ample evidence for all of that, even though I did not cover all of that evidence in this video.